Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hey everybody, Jonathan Bailor here with, I don't know, this might be the single greatest bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast ever. Simply because if I had to list, and I don't want to go too over the top here, but literally, if I had to list authors who have had the biggest influence on my life, this is in no particular order: Aristotle, Viktor Frankl, Stephen Covey, and today's guest, a man who really needs no other introduction for anyone who's plugged into the nutrition scene at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Taubes is here. What's up, Gary?
Hey, I'm still trying to figure out who those other writers are.
Well, I'm sure you're probably a little familiar with Aristotle.
Yes. Oh, I thought you said Eric Stottle.
Oh.
That's what confused me.
No.
We're ready to go.
Yes, no. You're right up there with Aristotle, Stephen Covey, and Viktor Frankl. So there you go.
Okay.
And probably Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi over at the University of Chicago, the guy who did all the flow work. So
yes, I actually interviewed Csikszentmihalyi. Is that how you pronounce? I interviewed him in my earlier life as a science journalist.
Oh, nice. Well,
yeah, I would have thrown Norman Juster into that.
Well, then you'd probably take yourself off the list, because I can't imagine that your own writing has influenced you more. No, I'm just kidding.
More than Norman Juster, absolutely not. You're right. I would have to take myself off the list and put Norman Juster on the list.
Well, Gary, for individuals who are maybe a little bit less familiar with your work, can you quickly, because I want to just get into it during this podcast, and I want people to understand a little bit about the man they're hearing from. So you've had numerous awards, numerous books. Can you just quickly take us through your CV?
CV, okay. Well, I was a physics writer. I have a physics degree. And I got involved in writing about controversial science in the mid-'80s. I got my first book. I went to live at this large physics lab outside Geneva, CERN, where they recently discovered the Higgs boson. And I thought I was going to be covering a great physics breakthrough, and I turned out to watch 150 very smart physicists discover non-existent elementary particles. And I got obsessed with this subject of controversial science, how easy it is to get the wrong answer in science and how hard it is to get the right answer. And after doing a couple of investigative articles and another book that touched on this subject, it was called Bad Science, so you could get the take. Well, some of my friends in the physics community said to me, if you're fascinated with bad science, you should look at some of this stuff in public health. So in the early 90s, I moved into public health, and I ended up by the late 90s writing a couple of major pieces for the journal Science on some of the, conventional wisdom, the dogma in nutrition that has very little evidence to support it, as it turned out. So it justified the term bad science to describe it, and that led me to write a legendary infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, New York Times Magazine story, What If Fat Doesn't Make You Fat? And that led me to doing two books, which is the reason why I'm here. Excuse me. One is Good Calories, Bad Calories, and the other is called Why We Get Fat. And they're both, is the subtitle of the first, suggest challenge the conventional wisdom on diet, nutrition, and chronic disease. And I learned an extraordinary amount. I went through much of the same learning process I assume you did, and it's depressing and dismaying to learn about the evidence base for not just our beliefs, but what our dietary guidelines, what we've been told to do for the past 50 years and 40 years.
Well, and Gary, obviously there's so much that is wrong and bad, but the thing that I wanted to dig into with you briefly is there's this, the idea that fat makes you fat, right, is probably the most common myth out there. And the thing that I was talking with actually Dr. Ron Rosedale the other day, and he made a point. He's just like, this actually isn't controversial. The idea that in fact a diet composed of more fat, if anything, makes your body better at burning fat because it becomes more of a preferred fuel source. Therefore, if you are in a state where you don't have enough calories, your body's like, well, I like burning fat, and I see this fat already sitting on your hips, so I'm just going to burn that, and I don't have excess insulin lying around to block it. So, why is the theory that eating fat makes you fat, which is intuitive but wrong, stick, while the fact that eating fat helps you to burn fat, which is just as, in some ways, intuitive, because it's just your body wants to burn what you eat, and if you're not eating enough of it, it'll eat it off your body. Why is one sticking and one isn't?
Well, and I'm going to challenge you on this, that there's a more pervasive misconception out there that then in turn leads to this secondary misconception that it's all about dietary fat driving weight gain. And so the more common and the more problematic and the sort of fundamental pillar of all our nutritional beliefs is that obesity is an energy issue, that it's a caloric balance issue, that your body, you said if you don't have enough calories, your body will burn fat. And I would argue that your body's going to burn fat anyway if you don't trigger the hormones and enzymes that make it store fat. So, this idea that the technical term is obesity is an energy balance disorder, but that what we should care about is the calories we consume minus the calories we expend. And it's all about eating too much and exercising too little. And if you care about eating too much, then caloric intake is what's driving fat accumulation. Then fat has the densest calories in the diet. So back in the 1960s, 1970s, when the obesity researchers or the nutritionists wanted to blame heart disease on eating dietary fat, and since obese individuals often get a lot of heart disease, obesity is associated with heart disease, they thought these things have to be caused by the same thing. So if dietary fat causes heart disease, it's got to cause obesity. How could it do that? Well, maybe it's just there's such dense calories in here, 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories for protein or carbohydrates. So it wasn't actually until the 1960s, 1970s that people started pushing this idea that it was dietary fat that caused us to get obese, and it could coexist nicely with this idea that dietary fat, saturated fat, causes heart disease. But the fundamental error in thinking is that it's about calories anyway, as opposed to just thinking of obesity as a kind of growth defect, like any other. I mean, if any other part of your body started expanding out of control, the doctors would be like, whoa, what's going on? What hormones and enzymes are out of control here that he's got this sort of huge lump of whatever growing out of his forehead or his, ankles but if it's your gut,
or you're
eating too much.
Exactly. Well, and Gary, I'm actually not sure. I literally have a playlist on my phone called Gary Taubes Interviews, and I think I've listened to every interview you've ever done, at least the ones that are available on iTunes. And the one question that I actually don't know if you've ever been asked directly, or I'm not sure if I've heard you answer it, and I'm super, super curious as to the way you would frame your answer. So are you ready?
Okay, shoot.
Okay.
I'm still trying to get over you listening to every interview I've ever done, which then means I have to think of new ways to say the same thing again. Go ahead.
All right. So and again, this is, and the reason I'm asking you this is because I get asked this question. I'm just curious how your answer compares to mine. So when I talk to someone and I say, generally my message is, it's the quality of the food you're eating makes the quantity of food you're eating irrelevant. And then people come back to me and they say, well, if I were to just drink, if I were to go on a butter fast and drink 10,000 calories of butter per day for a week, are you saying that I will not gain fat. And how would you respond to that?
Go ahead. Have a good time. Back to me. If you think you can do that, I actually had this conversation with a very good friend the other day who said, I can eat 10,000 calories a day. If I could do 7,000 calories in cashews and 3,000 in heavy cream, and I'm going to get fatter, right? And I said, well, actually, I don't know if you're going to get fatter. I don't know what your body's going to do. I know it's not going to like it. And the 7,000 interesting choice was cashews because they turn out to be 20% carbs by calories.
You're like, so there's your problem.
So that's one of the reasons why you can eat 7,000 calories of cashews is because you're going to be secreting insulin that will help you store the get the calories out of your bloodstream so more can get in there. Here's the way, it's a fascinating because that's a common response. Are you saying if I do X, like one of the reasons why obesity researchers insist that obesity was caused by overeating is they knew that you can slim somebody down by starving them, right? So you could say to yourself, if I starve myself for the next 6 months, I'm going to lose weight, right? I'm going to lose fat. Therefore, overeating is an energy thing. I just have to restrict energy. And yes, that's true, but the fact is you can't voluntarily starve yourself for the next 6 months because your body, you are a biological system with all these compensatory homeostatic phenomena that are going to fight starvation if there is food available. Okay, so the problem here is it's a rhetorical question. If I could force myself to eat 10,000 calories a day of fat, and I kept that up long enough, yes, I am sure that you would probably gain fat. Your body's going to have to do something with those calories. It's going to stick them in the fat tissue. But this is a different issue than why, and this was actually Edwin Astwood, the endocrinologist, wrote about this. I quote him in Good Calories, Bad Calories, back, I think it was early 1960s in an article on obesity, and he said, sure, we can make geese fat by force feeding them. And I'm sure you could do it with people, he said, but that's not how the circus fat lady got there. Okay? The fact is, obese people get obese without doing that.
Exactly.
So the question is why? And then the other side to this is there actually have been experiments where they've tried to do similar things, and I discussed that also in Good Calories, Bad Calories. So back in the late 60s, Ethan Sims did these experiments in New England where he wanted to fatten up subjects and see whether it was carbs or fat that made them fatter and study the fattening process. So the interesting thing is he first started with college students, and he tried to get them 20% fatter, and he couldn't do it, which makes me think college students in the late 60s are different than college students today, right? Because it should... there's this famous freshman 20 or whatever it is, which I think is up to the freshman 30. So anyway, so then he went to convicts at, I always forget if it's Vermont or New Hampshire. I think it was the Vermont State Prison. And the very first experiment they tried to do was to get them fat, and they never published this because they considered it a failed experiment. But they thought, we're going to show that you can get people fat on an Atkins diet, even though Atkins wasn't around yet. But it was a pure meat diet, fatty meat. And they described these convicts. I interviewed virtually all of his collaborators, including Sims himself. And his collaborators described these convicts sitting there with plates of pork chops in front of them that they refused to eat. So they couldn't get them to eat enough to get fat on this diet. And several of his collaborators said, I challenge anyone to get fat on an Atkins-like diet. Although this doesn't mean... there are people out on the internet, and I've gotten emails from people who say this has happened to them, so I think it can happen. But for the huge proportion of people, you just can't eat enough to get fatter.
And
then what?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So then what they tried to do is they decided they'd start with the convict's baseline diet, and then they'd get them to overeat of either carbohydrates or fat, and they'd again try to get them to put on 20% excess weight. So 200-pounder would get up to 240, which is a lot. And so with the carbohydrates, they realized that they could get them to eat, they'd go from, say, eating 3,000 calories a day to as many as 10,000 calories a day just by adding carbs. And then they'd say they'd go to bed hungry, okay, after tripling their caloric intake. But when they tried to get them to add fat to their diet, they had trouble doing it. So finally, they tried to get them to eat one extra stick of butter, like 800 calories of fat extra a day. And in the various articles they published on this, they referred to it as like the heroic effort of overeating on dietary fat, even though their baseline diet had carbs in it. Mm-hmm. So one of the points I'm trying to get people to understand is that you can't divorce the regulation of appetite from the regulation of energy storage, which is what we're talking about. The hormonal enzymatic regulation of fat metabolism and fatty acid availability for other tissues to burn for fuel. If you try to force that by, say, forcing someone to overeat, it's going to feed back on appetite and energy expenditure in such a way that they're not going to be able to do it.
And Gary, just to bring that home with a concrete example, actually one of the experiences in my life that led me down this path was I wasn't a participant in one of those formal experiments, but I was an individual who was naturally thin. And I have Excel spreadsheets from when I was in university trying to gain weight because I would track what I was eating. And I would do a double shot of olive oil like 6 times a day. Like I would just shoot glasses of oil in addition to my normal diet. I was consuming about 6,000 calories per day. And I was actively trying to gain weight, and I was not. I went to the bathroom a heck of a lot more, but I didn't actually gain weight.
Well, this is what, it's really fascinating, and it's the kind of experiment, what you just described is one of the experiments that I would eventually like to see our not-for-profit, which I hope we'll talk about, the Nutrition Science Initiative Fund. That's an extreme example of it. But, and again, I talked about this in Good Calories, Bad Calories, because one of the leading obesity researchers in the UK, a guy named Garrow, tried, in effect, the same experiment. He said to himself, I want to see how hard it is for a lean person to gain weight. Mm-hmm. Because if it's hard for a lean person to gain weight, then why wouldn't I expect it to be hard for an obese person to get lean? And he tried a lot of varieties, trying to force himself to eat 1,000 calories extra a day. And finally he settled on basically keeping cookies by his side all the time, at his desk, at his bed, and every time he thought about it, he forced himself to eat another cookie. And he did manage to gain about 15 or 20 pounds over a few months of hard work. And then as soon as he stopped the cookies, the weight went away. And his conclusion was, if it's so hard for a lean person to get fat, then obviously there's something else happening.
Absolutely. With
people who get fat easily. I have a brother 2 years older than me. When we were growing up, he was a kind of lean, you could see the veins on his arms when he was 8 years old and he's just tall, lean, thin, and I was the chunky one. And we both ate as much food as humanly possible. In fact, I joke, our dinners would last. This was back when my mother was a wonderful cook. We'd sit down to dinner at 7. We'd be done by 7:18, and my brother and I would have each polished off 3 courses. And if we didn't eat fast, if I was lollygagging, he'd get to the food before I could. And yet I grew up to be 6'2", and at my heaviest when I was playing football, I was almost 240, again, trying to be as heavy as possible. And I don't think he ever got over 195, and he was 6'5". He ran track and was a distance runner and a rower. I became a football player. Anatomy is destiny, as Freud said. But it's sort of, we just did something different with the food we ate. It wasn't about how much we ate. And he wasn't lean because he was an endurance runner and a rower. He was an endurance runner because he was lean and his body wanted, those were the sports for him.
Absolutely. And we forget about an entire population when we have these conversations, right? There's an entire population of people who are chronically underweight and are taking weight gainers and are seeing. And so if it is just, that's what I don't get, Gary. Is some of this stuff, like, it doesn't even seem like it's controversial. Like, but it remains controversial. Whereas, like, a common sense, you can say, like, if you eat the same way you ate when you were 15, when you're 55. You will gain weight, even if you eat the exact same way. Therefore, it can't just be about calories in, calories out. Like,
Although in that sense, you know, what they're going to do, the counter argument is it's the belief that your metabolism slows down. So, you know, you can be 6 foot 190 at 15 and eat 3,000 calories a day, but at 50, at 6 foot 190, you got to eat 2,000 because your metabolism slows. That's the belief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's fascinating. When I was, you know, we all go through this when we're young. It's one of the annoying things, by the way, when you get criticized by 23-year-old self-appointed nutrition gurus instead of 56-year-old self-appointed nutrition gurus like myself. I want to say, look, don't you understand? When I was 23, I could eat anything. And I had to try to get bigger. You know, it was hard work. Now I could do it effortlessly. You know, I could probably get up to 300 pounds if I wanted to.
Oh, and one, ask a postmenopausal woman. Right. I mean, these are the individuals who I work with. That literally, we call it side effect fat loss, where you'll have a postmenopausal woman she will eliminate fattening foods from her diet, replace them with non-fattening foods, and she will maybe see some results, but her husband, who's just getting this secondhand because maybe she's the one who takes care of the meals in the house, weight's just falling off. He's just burning fat. He doesn't even know what's going on. He's like, look, honey, my pants are falling off. And she's just like, damn you.
Yeah. So my question is, what do you do with those women? Because I hear from those people. And I understand they're secreting less estrogen. Estrogen suppresses fat formation. So they're fighting against hormones, not eating too much, but hormones. But have you found something that, you know, carb restrict, boom, but what else do you have to do?
Well,
what else do they have to do? And I know this should be about me, but...
No. I think it's actually, I sometimes, like one of the things I actually like about what Tim Ferriss talked about in his work is he joked, and this is a joke, that first they do them to racehorses. First they take a technique and they apply it to racehorses. Then they take a technique and they apply it to bodybuilders. And then if it works, you might get like a teeny tiny sliver of it enters popular culture. And I think this, and again, listeners, don't take this the wrong way, but if we can do things to essentially help a woman's body to work more like a man's body, and this involves things like very intense strength training. It involves things like the way they manage stress. Like traditionally, women tend to not compartmentalize as well as men, and therefore will have higher chronic levels of stress hormones. Whereas, you know, like their husband gets home and he just sits down and veggies out, she's worried. So if you can, like, for example, take the exercise-related hormones and flip those into more of a male burn fat rather than store fat type of dynamic, as well as having your stress hormones shift in favor of being less stressed, I think it's certainly not a magic pill, but I've seen it help a lot.
Interesting.
And certainly that does need to, and to be very clear, none of that matters if the diet isn't right. I mean, what you're eating is such a huge component, but it's a bit like if you aren't a naturally thin person, you essentially have to look at every area of your life and what you can do to make, because again, like even how much you sleep, even how much you sleep affects your hormonal balance. So that quality and quantity of sleep, it just gets harder. I mean, it stinks, but it's just reality, sadly.
Yeah. No, some things just aren't fair. I wonder actually if there's an evolutionary side to it as well, but it stretches it's a just so story, so I won't get into it. But
well, and Gary, just one other thing I wanted to dig into really quick, and I certainly want to talk about what we can do to help solve this with your work with NuSci. But one thing that you do so well is you tackle this problem of causality, and that is so important. And you touched on that earlier, where you said, for example, a person will eat less and they'll lose weight. So then they'll say, therefore, weight is gained when you eat too much, which is a bit like saying, okay, I have a fever, I get into an ice bath, my body temperature goes down, therefore the fever was caused by me being in too hot of an environment to begin with. Like you can't these causal associations are just ludicrous. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, this is there's a lot of different ways that you run into this also. I mean, one is indeed that the obesity research community just hung on to this idea that if you can starve people and make them lose weight, therefore they got fat to begin with by eating too much. I mean, the therefore that I inserted is completely logically incorrect, but that tends to be how we think. The other way that this manifests itself is if you go on for instance, carbohydrate-restricted diet and you both lose weight and eat less, therefore the eating less was what caused the weight loss. So what we do all over, throughout our lives is we tend to insert causal pathways into observations that we see that we have no idea whether they really are causal or not. So this happens simultaneously with that, therefore this caused that or that caused this, and depending on our preconceptions, we go one way or the other. Science is ultimately about establishing. This is something Claude Bernard said, and I've been writing about science for about 25 years. When I read this, Claude Bernard was this legendary French physiologist who lived in the 19th century and wrote a great book called An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine, the first third of which I think should be required reading for anyone who's in science or thinking about science. And Bernard said that basically science is about trying to come up with causes for the things that we see. So you observe something in nature and you want to figure out what caused it, whether it's the universe in the night sky or the extra fat you've got on your body. And the way you do that, you can't do it usually from observation. It's almost, unless it's something blatant, like you see somebody fire a gun and the person next to him, falls over dead with a hole in him, you can imply that the causality was fairly clear. But in most things, it's kind of complicated, and that's when you do experiments. And, in this sense, what I find detrimental, it was the idea that, if you make someone eat less and they lose weight, therefore they got fat by eating too much is sophistic. But also this idea that if you eat less on a diet, that means, and you lose weight, that means the diet worked by eating less, and that somehow sucked the necessary fat out of your fat tissue. And that's equally as pernicious in this field, because you want to know if a diet, if a particular regimen of eating works, why did it work? Like, this is an experience virtually all of us have who try carbohydrate-restricted diets at one point. You spend your whole life, if you're predisposed to be heavy, trying to control it, trying to regulate it, usually by some form of eating less. And, even when I was younger, I dieted off and on throughout the 90s. I worked out all the time. Actually, from the 80s to the 90s, my whole life I was basically trying to maintain a certain weight that was, say, 10 pounds lower than whatever I was. Mm-hmm. And I was hungry all the time. I hated dieting. Couldn't stand it. I mean, there's just this idea, and you think about food constantly. When can I have my next meal? How much can I eat? How slowly should I eat it to make it last as long as possible? What foods can I order that'll minimize the calories in it? I used to go on sushi diets because somewhere I read that a full plate of sushi was only 300 calories. It was interesting. I'd lose like 10 pounds in 2 weeks, and then I'd want to blow my brains out, and I'd have to have a quarter pounder with cheese to make me. Anyway, and then you do this, so you restrict carbohydrates, you don't worry about fat, and you eat, all these foods that'll supposedly kill you, and suddenly the weight just falls off, and you're not hungry. And it's this experience of losing weight without hunger that, to me, is one of the fundamental observations in the field. It goes against everything. Like all the conventional wisdom is the only way to lose weight is either eat less or exercise more. I mean, to create a negative energy balance. And how do you know you're in a negative energy balance? Because you're hungry. And suddenly, here's this way where you just lose weight without hunger, and it tells you something fundamentally different is going on.
Well, and Gary, I think that is just so. This issue of causality and what follows what. Some of the, I mean, that's what you do is so important to help people to take a step back. And an analogy that I've tried to use, the traditional mindset that we're talking about here is you eat more food and that causes you to have more body fat. And like, let's actually take a step back, and there's two points to make. One is if you eat more junk, like if you eat more garbage, what that actually causes is you're actually eating more of the foods that cause you to become fat, and then you become fat. But you're not fat because you ate more food. You ate more fattening foods, and that's the key distinction there, is that yes, people who eat a lot of a traditional Western diet oftentimes are fat, but that's because they're eating a lot of a traditional Western diet. Like, and why is it so hard to get the mainstream to accept the fact that it's not eating a lot of food, it's eating a lot of the wrong types of foods, and there's that just step in the middle, right? It's eat more food is not the problem. But if you ate more junk food and that caused the amount of fattening foods you ate to go up, then body fat goes up. I get that. The extension to exercise that I try to use, that I think people grok somewhat immediately, is people...
I haven't heard the word grok used in a conversation since 1984. So thank you.
Well, no, my pleasure. Well, it's pretty cool beans. There's another old friend. So when people often think you exercise, or for a man, if a man wants to build muscle, what does he do? Exercise. Therefore, exercise causes your muscles to grow. But there's another way a man can make his muscles grow. Inject steroids. If a man injects steroids into his body and just sits down, muscle will grow. So that then says, okay, well, it's actually hormones that are closer to the causal agent of muscle development. And so wait, what does exercise have to do with this? Oh, okay, maybe exercise triggers the hormones, which then trigger muscle development. Okay, and people seem to get that. So we say, okay, imagine if food did something similar, meaning food doesn't actually make you fat. Food triggers hormones, and those hormones dictate whether or not you're becoming fat. What do you think about that?
Crazy. Absolute quackery. Don't you believe in the laws of thermodynamics? Let's be serious. No, I mean, it's a great... I use height for the metaphors, and the same things, but I'm making the same argument. The child's growing. You're never going to say that he's growing because he's eating more than he's expending. They're absolutely certain. The reason he's growing is because his pituitary gland is secreting growth hormone that's stimulating insulin-like growth factor that's telling his cells and his bones and everything to grow, and he's eating to compensate, right? But as soon as you get to the fat tissue, it's got to be about this energy balance thing. Actually, one of the things where you were talking about causality was interesting, because one of the reasons people believe exercise is so important for weight loss, right, is because they look at marathon runners, and they're so slender, And how is it hard not to believe that I fell for this for decades. I kept thinking, if I somehow ran enough, I would go from being the sort of hippopotamus that my body kind of wants to be, maybe not a hippopotamus, but a basset hound, to a greyhound. That if you just do it literally, I could picture in my head for decades that if I could just get my distance up far enough, I would somehow become one of these people who just, flew over the road and ran effortlessly, and it's just my body didn't do that. And in fact, the joke is I can never get far enough before something would break down, my back, my knees, And yet, like I said, my brother could do 10 miles run like it was a walk around the block for me. That's what his body did. But you see these marathon runners, and the joke is, like, you could imagine thinking, boy, if I only ran 26 miles a day, I too would become 5'6", 120 pounds in Kenyan. One of the best, I use this in Why We Get Fat, but I found I've started doing it more when I lecture, and I lectured a couple weeks ago actually to cancer surgeons in Los Angeles, and I caught them all nodding. But there's this idea that if you wanted to make yourself hungry, what would you do? If I was having a huge dinner party tonight, and I had the 10 best chefs in the Oakland coming to cook dinner, and I invited you, and the invitation said the best food you've ever tasted. It's like one of these Top Chef, dinners, and it's going to be endless portions, one wonderful taste sensation after another, and I want you to come, and I want you to come hungry. Bring your appetite. What would you do? And the obvious answer is like, you'd eat less during the day, right? Maybe skip lunch even, and certainly skip your afternoon snack and eat smaller portions, and you'd probably exercise more too. So if you didn't have a workout plan, you'd do a workout. If you had a workout, you'd make it a longer workout. Now, you might say, I'm going to walk to Taubes' house. It's only 5 miles. I still have appetite. So the exact same things that normal people would do to make sure that they're hungry are the two things, eat less, exercise more, that we tell overweight people to do to lose weight. Mm-hmm. And that alone should tell you that there's something fundamentally wrong with how we think about this. And yet I could have the same conversation with, one of the obesity researchers in the world, and they'll look at me like they're talking to a creationist or something.
Yeah, and that's, again, Gary, that's exactly like you just said. The very thing that stimulates appetite the most is the thing we tell people to do to combat this condition. And along those similar veins, if you actually look physiologically at what happens to the body when you do starve it, it's literally like if you describe the analogy of a basset hound versus a greyhound. And in some ways, what we're talking about here is rather than taking the body of a greyhound and try to make the greyhound run until it turns into the basset hound, like the body's different. We got to understand that. And I think the more productive approach is to say, okay, is there anything that can be done to take the body of someone who is naturally more predisposed to storing fat and make it work like the body of someone who is more predisposed to burning fat? And if you look at what actually happens in the body when you starve yourself, is your body shifts more towards the spectrum of an individual predisposed to storing fat. And right. So like you were literally making your body more into the chronic state. It's like you're worsening your fever. The thing you're doing to try to cure your fever is actually like compounding the virus in your body.
All right.
So stop. Stop. Don't starve yourself. It's bad.
Yeah, but that seems simple to us. Why is it so difficult for other people to understand?
Well, and let's.
I mean, and you've probably asked me this question already, but literally, you talk to the large proportion of individuals in the obesity research community and the journalists who cover it can hear this over and over again, and it will not stick. It has no effect on their thinking process. And we could talk about cognitive dissonance and groupthink if we want, but it's very difficult. I've got 10th graders in high school who write me and get it instantly. And yet, really smart people. It's like sometimes I try to understand what you say to yourself, that a lot of Republicans in the country, there must be some really smart Republicans, right? So therefore, I should talk to them and understand why we just can't agree on anything. But here, it's sort of like, these are really smart people. What is it that makes this so hard to understand? That you're just talking about, even just not to agree with, just to understand that it's not some weird rhetorical game we're playing, and that it's got nothing to do with whether the laws of thermodynamics are true or not, because they're always true. And that it's just that there can be a different causality to this. About a month ago, I was lecturing to cardiologists, and I said, why is it that obesity is in your entire medical career, from the minute you enter med school till the day you retire, there is only one disorder that you will ever go to a physics textbook for the means of cure and prevention and to understand, and that's obesity. Every other disorder you're ever confronted with, whatever it is, you'll go to a medical textbook or a biochemistry textbook or an endocrinology textbook. suddenly here it's like a physics problem. It's crazy.
Well, and Gary, I think, and this is just, I think, it may be a semantic issue, but I don't know if it actually is. If I go to someone and I say, eating less and exercising more, like essentially if you could eat nothing and just walk all day long, if I were to say to them that will not cause you to lose weight, of course they would say I'm crazy. And in fact, I would be crazy, because the statement of if I ate no calories and walked all day, I would lose weight is true. However, I think what we're actually
flip side to that 10,000 calories a day.
Exactly.
10,000 calories a day.
Exactly. But my macro point is that I don't think our goal is actually just to lose weight. I think the conversation we're actually having is how do we keep our body from storing excess body fat sustainably for the rest of our life. And like if you were to say, well, the way you do that is just by like not sleeping for the rest of your life, people would look at you and say you're crazy, because they'd say, well, Gary, I need to sleep. Like sleeping is required. I can't just sleep less. Like eventually my body will win. But that is what people say, well, you just need to eat less. But I can't. Yes, eating less will cause weight loss, but it will cause temporary weight loss. I'll get dehydrated. I'll burn off my muscle tissue. So is what we're talking about weight loss, or is what we're talking about long-term fat loss?
Well, and that's it, yeah. What you want is long-term fat loss. You don't want to just, you can semi-starve yourself or even starve yourself and force a short-term effect from it. But even if you could keep it up for life, you would not be healthier for doing it.
Exactly.
I was just talking to a email conversation with a psychologist today who said there's actually a new sort of anorexia syndrome that's going to be in the next, what does DSM stand for? But it's women who are not emaciated, but don't eat. So even there, it's sort of an the question is, what you want is your body to work like a healthy body. So you want it to burn fat like a healthy person burns. You want it to have metabolic flexibility, in effect, so you can store fat and burn it and be healthy, and your risk factors for heart disease are healthy. And there's sort of sometimes one of the arguments against what I've been arguing, and what I think what you're arguing is that this isn't just about weight loss; it's about health. As though we're arguing that you give up carbohydrates, yes, you'll look better and you'll be slimmer, but you'll be less healthy. And the point is, you will be more healthy. But you want starvation is not a means to increase long-term health. It's just a short-term, behavioral activity that is going to do more harm than good, probably in the short term. And it's actually one of the reasons, this idea that eating less is a way to cure obesity or to treat it or to treat excess weight may be one of the reasons why there's this observation now that may or may not be true, that overweight individuals are actually, have less morbidity and mortality than people with a BMI from 20 to 25 or supposedly at an ideal weight. And it could be that because people are trying to starve themselves to get into that. I don't know if that's true, because it's hard to make sense of these associations, but it's one possibility.
Oh, absolutely. If one assumes that one must eat a diet that contains these fattening starches and sweets, and that's the other, I think, problem here, Gary, is let's assume, like most of the people out there, that is truth. Like, you have to eat starches and sweets. Like, that's the reasonable thing to do. Well, then if you were to eat less of that diet, you would be better off, but not because you're eating less, but because you're eating less of the fattening foods.
Right.
It's just like if we assume that everyone has to smoke, if you were to smoke 1 pack a day versus 2 packs a day, that would be preferable, but why not just not smoke?
Why not? Yeah, it's interesting. One of the studies that was published in the last few years was on calorie restricted diets in primates. I think they were rhesus monkeys.
Oh, yes, yeah. The life extension one?
Yeah, and it was fascinating because I was talking to the fellow who did the research, Rick Weindrich, and he pointed out, and so one of the interesting things, you calorie restrict these monkeys, and they couldn't show that they lived longer, but they had less diabetes and cancer, but they still got diabetes and cancer. So if you know from reading my books, there's reasonable evidence that diabetes and cancer are diseases of Western diets or civilizations, and that populations eating their traditional diets, absent sugar and white flour and maybe vegetable oils, didn't get these diseases. So I was curious why the calorie-restricted primates would still get diabetes and cancer, and I asked Weindrich what the diet was, and it turns out that these diets are about 30% sugar, and I think it was 20% cornstarch, and this is a diet that some organization decided was the diet in which these monkeys thrived in captivity, by which they probably meant they looked plump and healthy. And so when you're calorie restricting a diet that's 30% sugar, right, they're getting significantly less sugar.
Exactly.
So that could explain why they're healthier, but if they didn't get any sugar and any cornstarch and just ate their natural diet, they might be able to eat as much as they want and not get diabetes and cancer at all. But those studies don't get funded.
Well, and that is why you exist, sir. So let's transition the last part of the interview into, you have done an amazing job, arguably better than anyone else in the industry, of exposing the problem here. And now you're focused on helping to engineer a solution with your nonprofit organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, well, so this is with Dr. Peter Attia in San Diego, so he deserves as much credit or more. We met a couple years ago after he had gone through his own learning experience with his own weight and much of the research that we did, and then had read my books, and we decided that we were going to do something about this. We didn't know what it was. So the easiest thing to do, one of the ideas I always had, was there were some simple experiments that could be done that could demonstrate, again, that the weight loss on a carbohydrate-restricted diet is a different phenomena than weight loss on a calorie-restricted diet. And you could, in effect, disassociate the weight loss from calorie restriction. And I thought that if you could do that, you can do it in animals, but people don't pay attention to these animal studies. So I thought if we could do this in humans, we might get the obesity research community to begin to understand something they've never wanted to study. So their perspective towards these carbohydrate-restricted diets is they're fads that just sort of fool people into eating less. Maybe people eat less because they're bored, or they just can't buy enough non-carb food to eat as much as they used to. And so, yeah, sure, people lose weight, but they do it because they eat less, and they don't stay on the diets anyway, so it's not relevant. They never saw these diets as relevant to the question of why we get fat. And I thought there were particular experiments that could be done, well-controlled experiments. We just needed a mechanism to fund these experiments. It was incredibly naive. But Peter and I, with the help of some wonderful friends of Peter, started doing the legal work to start this not-for-profit that we call the Nutrition Science Initiative, because one of the things we want to do within this, the ultimate mission is to reduce the burden of obesity and diabetes, but the strategy to do it is through getting really good nutrition. There's sort of nutrition science done that's as rigorous and ironclad as the science in the fields like physics that I grew up in. And it's much harder to do in nutrition because you're dealing with real human beings, and they're different creatures and, for instance, elementary particles or circuits. So we were doing this as a nights and weekend type endeavor, and a year ago in November, I did a podcast called Econ Talk with Russ Roberts, who's an economist at GW University in, I forget if it's in Virginia or Washington, D.C. And a couple of days after this podcast, I got an email from a fellow named John Arnold, who said he runs a foundation in Houston. They don't do obesity research, but they're interested in getting into it, or obesity funding. Said I had mentioned a couple of experiments on the air. And so anyway, one thing led to another. Turns out that John Arnold's a very wealthy philanthropist. and his foundation is doing some amazing things. And after a long, many conversations and meetings, they agreed to support the Nutrition Science Initiative. So we now have offices in San Diego, and we have a staff, and they've also committed a significant amount of money to experiments that we want to fund. And we put together a consortium of researchers, influential, thoughtful obesity researchers who have been in the field for a long time, who, without exception, think I'm wrong, think we're wrong, but acknowledge that their belief that it's all about calories and energy balance is not sort of demonstrated unambiguously in the literature, that there's a lot of room for this alternative hypothesis that obesity is a kind of hormonal regulatory defect driven by the triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. So they've designed an experiment beginning with the pilot experiment that'll directly test this hypothesis. I can't give details yet because until contracts are in place, everybody's very hesitant about this being discussed publicly. But experiments, it should really, like I said, be able to disassociate weight loss from eating less or exercising more.
Mm-hmm.
And the laws of thermodynamics will still hold, but because they always do, but you'll change the macronutrient composition of the diet dramatically and in an inpatient setting. So one of the key problems we identified with much of existing obesity research, first of all, it's done in the context, everyone thinks this is all about what diet works best because it's clear that we get fat because we eat too much. That's the underlying assumption. And so if you're studying dietary manipulations, it's only saying something about what diet works best, and then they do what called free living experiments, where you get, say, 500 subjects, if you've got a lot of money, and you randomize them into two or four groups, and you give their group different diet books and different counseling, and you set them off into the world. And you let them, and then they come back in 3 months and 6 months and 1 year and 2 years, and you measure them and do blood tests and look at heart disease risk factors, and then you say which diet is better or worse. And even in this scenario, the low-carb diet always ends up doing better than the others, but it's equally clear that nobody stays on the diets. So my metaphor for this, imagine if you wanted to know whether cigarettes cause lung cancer, and your way of doing it was to take 500 people and randomize them to 4 groups and put one group on the nicotine patch and one group on nicotine gum and one group got nicotine nasal spray, and the 4th group had to try and quit cold turkey. Maybe there's a 5th group that continues to smoke, and then you followed them for 2 years, and lo and behold, at the end of 2 years, virtually everyone was still smoking. And then you concluded that from this that cigarettes don't cause lung cancer. And this is pretty much what they do. So they say, look, at the end of 2 years, everyone's fallen off their diet. They've all lost 4 pounds on average. Doesn't matter what diet we put them on there for. This demonstrates that obesity is all about calories, and you got to eat less if you want to lose weight. So what we want to do is put people in a metabolic ward in an inpatient setting, and they get fed particular diets. This is the simplest way to think of this. So you figure out how much energy somebody expends, which is a relatively straightforward process, and then you put them on a diet, say, no carbohydrates or a diet with a lot of carbohydrates, but you make sure that what they're eating is the same amount of energy that they expend every day. So you match intake to expenditure, or you could even increase intake over expenditure. You could do your olive oil experiment instead. And then you see what happens to fat mass and energy expenditure when you know exactly how much they started expending, and you know exactly how much they're giving them, and you know they're eating it because they're locked in this metabolic ward. They can't cheat. And you watch them eat it, you monitor them. So they've been a very rigorously well-controlled experiment, the kind of thing you're taught to do in 8th grade science, which is, control your variables. Then you pick you can't only pick one variable to change in diets, because if you change, say, the carbohydrate content, you got to replace it with something. So you might replace it by adding fat or protein. But you try to minimize the number of variables that are changed. You try to control everything. And by doing this, we should be able to resolve these controversies. It's expensive, a lot more expensive than we imagined when we started this. But it seems like we're going to have the money to pay for these. So it should be interesting. Hopefully within 3 or 4 years, we'll have pretty conclusive evidence one way or the other.
Well, that's awesome, Gary. I'm really, really looking forward to that research, because I think if we can add that to the pretty unambiguous at this point research, for example, that just exercising more does not lead to fat loss, which again, I mean, even your, the organization you're associated with, the New York Times, seems to report on this at least 4 times a year. All this research is showing that exercise isn't really important for fat loss, and that no good study has ever really shown that it does. But they're like, well, you should still exercise. so I'm curious if we'll be able to then take the science, which is relatively unambiguous, because there's plenty of areas where it is pretty unambiguous, but then get people to, again, like you said, these arguments seem pretty straightforward. I'm hoping this will set it over the edge. I applaud you for getting the funding and doing the research. I'm very excited to see it.
It's interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether we can get people to accept these studies for what they are. One of the issues we talk about a lot is, as you talk about with the New York Times, every week they have 2-4 diet, nutrition, health stories, or exercise stories. So the question is, if you do the best experiment ever done by 2 orders of magnitude, how do you get the press and the research community to understand that this is the best experiment ever done, and that it trumps what's been done since?
Yeah.
And so my nightmare is they do this experiment, they get the results that we would expect. They might not. This is science. You never know. We could be wrong. And but assuming they get the experiment, and then they publish it, and it shows up in the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA, and then it's on the front page of the New York Times. One hopes, because it's this dramatic result contrary to all conventional wisdom, and then 2 days later there's another story, and then there's a piece about the new animal experiment, and then there's a piece about some grad student's poster session at a conference in Montana, and everything just keeps rolling along in this huge establishment that's grown up to generate nutrition news. It's almost as though there can't be a right answer, right? Because then what are we going to say?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to fill the pages of these newspapers? So there's got to be an endless controversy. So anyway. But yeah, it'll be interesting. And one of the things we love that's so great about the Arnold Foundation is part of their strategy as a philanthropy is to make sure that the ways they invest money that it's not just like throwing a book in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
That it has an effect, that so that we, we talk to the journalists, we talk to the research community, we talk to the policymakers so they know, why this is being done and what the goal is and what this means and why it's different from other experiments and why it conceivably trumps the other experiments and what makes it such a game changer, assuming the results actually do change the game.
Which, if your previous work is any indication of what will be your future work, I have all the confidence in the world that it will, Gary, because you've certainly started changing the game already. So I'm very excited to see the results here.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It will be. I just keep my fingers crossed.
No, I love it. It will be interesting. The question is, what type of interesting will it be? There's no. There will be an exciting ending to this movie. We just don't know what the ending will be.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Oh, Gary. Well, thank you. So I know you're an extremely busy man, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us today. And I literally have another half page of notes here. So if you'd be so willing, I'd love to have you back on the show in a few months.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again. Thanks for having me, and I may even be coherent if we do it again.
Well, everybody, if you haven't checked out Gary's work, please do check out Good Calories, Bad Calories, a little bit more ambitious of a text. Don't be intimidated by it, though. It will change your life. And if you need a little on-road onto that book, read his second book, which is called Why We Get Fat. And I know he didn't want to include this part in the title, and what we can do about it. I remember that interview you were in. You were like, I didn't want to add that, but my publisher made me. And please do check out NUSI or NUSI.org and help support them. Share it, Facebook, Twitter. Keep the momentum going. I personally think we're at right position on the edge of a tipping point, and I think Gary, your organization, NUSI, is going to be a pivotal role in tipping us over the edge. So thank you again.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. Take care.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed the show. And remember, this week and every week after, eat more and exercise less, but do that smarter. Talk to you soon.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.